She traded herself for shelter. But the scarred rancher gave her a home and a future she never dared to dream. The first snowflakes of winter were beginning to fall as 24-year-old Emma Sullivan clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wind cut through the thin fabric of her dress like a knife, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Behind her, the lights of the small Montana town grew dimmer with each step she took into the darkness. Emma had been walking for hours now, her feet numb in her inadequate boots, her stomach hollow with hunger she'd grown accustomed to over the past months. The money she'd saved from her work at the general store had run out weeks ago, and Mrs. Henderson, her landlady, had finally lost patience with Emma's promises to pay the rent. "I'm sorry, dear," the older woman had said that morning, though her voice carried little warmth. "But I can't run a charity. You'll need to find somewhere else to stay." Now, as the snow began to fall harder, Emma wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake leaving town. But what choice did she have? The other boarding houses had already turned her away, and winter in Montana was not forgiving to those caught without shelter. In the distance, she could see the warm glow of a lamp in a ranch house window. The sight of it made her chest tight with longing. She'd heard talk in town about the man who lived there, Jacob Turner, 32 years old, a solitary figure who rarely came to town except for supplies. The whispers followed him wherever he went, people speaking in hushed tones about the terrible accident that had left scars across the left side of his face and taken his young wife 3 years ago. Emma had seen him once, months ago, when he'd come into the store for supplies. She remembered his dark hair, the way he carried himself with quiet dignity despite the curious stares and poorly concealed whispers of other customers. But mostly, she remembered his eyes, deep brown and filled with a sadness that seemed to echo her own. The snow was falling so heavily now that Emma could barely see the path ahead. Her legs felt like lead, and she stumbled, catching herself just before falling face first into a snowbank. The cold was seeping into her bones, making her thoughts sluggish and confused. She needed shelter, and she needed it soon. The ranch house ahead was her only hope. Emma had never considered herself particularly brave, but desperation had a way of making heroes out of ordinary people. She forced her feet to keep moving, one step after another, until she found herself standing at the front door of the ranch house. Through the frosted window, she could see Jacob Turner, sitting by the fireplace, reading a book. The sight of such simple domestic comfort made her eyes sting with tears she couldn't afford to shed in the cold. She raised her trembling hand and knocked. The door opened, and Jacob stood there, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he took in her snow-covered figure and chattering teeth. "Please," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need shelter. I can work, I can cook and clean and I'll do whatever you need. I have nowhere else to go." Jacob studied her face for a long moment, and Emma could see him taking in her desperation, the way her shoulders shook with cold and exhaustion. When he stepped aside to let her in, she nearly collapsed with relief. "Come in before you freeze to death," he said quietly, his voice rough with disuse but not unkind. The warmth of the house hit Emma like a wave, and she swayed on her feet. Jacob caught her arm, steadying her with gentle hands. "When did you last eat?" he asked, guiding her toward the fireplace. Emma tried to remember. "Yesterday morning, I think, maybe the day before." Jacob's jaw tightened, and Emma caught a glimpse of anger in his eyes. Not at her, she realized, but at the circumstances that had brought her to his door. "Sit," he said, settling her into a chair near the fire. "I'll get you something warm." As Jacob moved around the kitchen, Emma took in her surroundings. The house was simple but well maintained, with handmade furniture, and touches that spoke of a woman's presence. A woman who was no longer there. Photographs on the mantel showed Jacob with a pretty blonde woman, both of them smiling in happier times. Jacob returned with a bowl of soup and a thick slice of bread. Emma's hands shook as she accepted the food, and she had to force herself to eat slowly despite her body's desperate hunger. "What's your name?" Jacob asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Emma Sullivan," she replied between spoonfuls of the most delicious soup she'd ever tasted. "I worked at Henderson's general store until they had to let me go." Jacob nodded, understanding passing between them without need for further explanation. Times were hard for everyone, and jobs were scarce. "You said you could work," he said after a moment. "What kind of work?" Emma straightened, trying to summon what little dignity she had left. I can cook and clean. I helped my mother run our household before she passed. I can mend clothes, tend a garden, care for animals. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Turner. Just Jacob, he said quietly. And you can stay. The spare room is small, but it's warm and dry. We can discuss work arrangements in the morning. Emma felt tears prick her eyes, but this time she didn't try to hold them back. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how to repay such kindness. Jacob stood, turning toward the fire so she couldn't see his scarred face clearly. Everyone deserves a chance to start over, he said simply. That night, as Emma lay in the small but comfortable bed Jacob had prepared for her, she listened to the wind howling outside and felt gratitude wash over her like a warm blanket. She'd expected to trade her labor for basic shelter, but Jacob had offered her something more precious, dignity, and a place where she didn't have to apologize for her circumstances. The next morning, Emma woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly in her cleanest dress and found Jacob in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the easy movements of a man accustomed to caring for himself. Good morning, he said, glancing up as she entered. In the morning light, she could see his scars more clearly, the puckered skin that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a testament to whatever accident had changed his life. But she also noticed the kindness in his eyes, the way his mouth almost smiled when he saw her. Good morning, Emma replied, moving toward the stove. Please let me. You've already done so much. Jacob hesitated, then stepped aside. I usually just make simple meals. I'm not much of a cook. Emma smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in weeks. Then you're in luck. My mother always said I had a gift for making even the simplest ingredients taste like a feast. As they worked together to prepare breakfast, Emma found herself relaxing in Jacob's quiet presence. He wasn't much of a talker, but there was something comforting about his steady, reliable nature. When he did speak, his words carried weight, as if he'd learned to value them carefully. Tell me about the ranch, Emma said as they sat down to eat. Have you been here long? Bought it 5 years ago, Jacob replied, cutting his eggs with precise movements. My wife, Catherine, she loved this place. Said it had good bones and just needed some love to make it shine. Emma heard the pain in his voice when he mentioned his wife, and she understood that some wounds ran deeper than scars on the skin. She sounds like she was a wise woman, Emma said gently. Jacob nodded, his eyes distant. She was? She had plans for this place, wanted to expand the garden, maybe add some chickens. Said a ranch wasn't complete without fresh eggs every morning. Emma smiled softly. She was right about that. There's something satisfying about gathering eggs, knowing you're providing for yourself and your family. Would you like to see the property? Jacob asked after they'd finished eating. I could show you around, let you know what needs doing. Emma bundled up in her shawl and followed Jacob outside. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world covered in a pristine white blanket that sparkled in the morning sun. The ranch was larger than she'd expected, with a barn, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures where a small herd of cattle grazed contentedly. It's beautiful, Emma said, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Catherine was right. It does have good bones. Jacob glanced at her, something shifting in his expression. You think so? I do. I can see the potential here. With some work, some attention to detail, this could be one of the finest ranches in the territory. They spent the morning walking the property, with Jacob explaining the daily routines and Emma asking thoughtful questions. She could see that he'd let some things slide over the past few years. The garden was overgrown with weeds, the chicken coop stood empty, and several of the fences needed mending. It's a lot of work for one person, Emma observed. Jacob nodded, his jaw tightening. I manage. But Emma could see the toll it was taking on him. Jacob Turner was a man carrying the weight of grief and responsibility alone, and it showed in the tired lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed perpetually tense. Over the following days, Emma threw herself into the work with a determination that surprised them both. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, organized the pantry, and began planning improvements for the spring garden. She cooked hearty meals that filled the house with warmth and wonderful smells, and slowly, she began to see changes in Jacob. He smiled more often, lingered over meals instead of eating in solitary silence, and began sharing stories about his plans for the ranch. Emma found herself looking forward to these conversations, the way Jacob's eyes lit up when he talked about his dreams for the future. I've been thinking about those chickens Catherine wanted, he said one evening as they sat by the fire. Spring would be a good time to get started with a small flock. Emma looked up from the sock she was mending. I think that's a wonderful idea. I could help build the coop. Make sure it's secure against predators. Jacob studied her face in the firelight. You don't have to stay, you know. Spring will bring new opportunities, new jobs in town. Emma's hand stilled on her mending. The thought of leaving the ranch, leaving Jacob, made her chest tight with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. Is that what you want for me to leave? No, Jacob said quietly, his honesty surprising them both. I've gotten used to having you here. The house feels alive again. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she ducked her head back to her work. I've gotten used to being here too. This feels more like home than anywhere I've lived since my mother passed. Winter deepened around them, bringing fierce storms that kept them housebound for days at a time. But instead of feeling trapped, Emma found these forced periods of solitude peaceful. She and Jacob developed routines that felt natural and comfortable. She would read aloud in the evenings while he worked on ranch equipment. They would cook together on Sundays, and they would sit by the fire in companionable silence when words weren't necessary. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Emma finally asked about the accident that had scarred Jacob's face. You don't have to tell me, she said quickly when she saw him tense. I want you to know that it doesn't matter to me. The scars, I mean, they don't change who you are. Jacob was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Barn fire, he said simply. Catherine was trapped inside. I got her out, but the roof beam came down as we were escaping. She died from the smoke she'd inhaled, and I was left with these reminders of my failure to save her. Emma felt tears sting her eyes. Oh, Jacob, you didn't fail her. You tried to save her. That's what love does. It tries even when the odds are impossible. Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and Emma saw something shift in his expression. How did you get to be so wise at 24? Emma smiled sadly. Loss has a way of teaching us things we never wanted to learn, but it also teaches us to recognize precious things when we find them. As winter began to give way to spring, Emma and Jacob worked together to prepare for the new season. They ordered chickens from town, planned the garden, and began the work of mending fences and repairing winter damage. Emma found herself humming as she worked, something she hadn't done in years. The future, which had once seemed so uncertain and frightening, now held promise and possibility. It was on a warm April morning, as they worked together in the garden, that Jacob finally spoke the words that had been growing between them all winter. Emma, he said, straightening from where he'd been planting beans. I need to tell you something. Emma looked up from the tomato seedlings she was transplanting, her heart suddenly beating faster. When you first came here, I thought I was offering you shelter, Jacob continued, his voice steady but emotional. But you've given me so much more than I ever gave you. You've given me back my life, my hope, my reason to care about tomorrow. Emma stood, brushing dirt from her hands. Jacob, I know I'm not much to look at anymore, he said, unconsciously touching his scarred cheek. And I know you came here out of necessity, not choice. But if you'd be willing, if you could see past what I've become. Emma stepped closer, placing her hand gently on his scared cheek. Jacob's eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't pull away. What you've become, Emma said softly, is the kindest, most generous man I've ever known. These scars don't define you, Jacob. Your actions do. Your heart does. Jacob covered her hand with his own, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I love you, Emma. I never thought I'd say those words to anyone again, but I love you. I love you too, Emma whispered, and she realized that the words had never been more true. I came here looking for shelter, but you gave me a home. You gave me a future I never dared to dream. Jacob kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Emma felt the last of her walls crumble. She'd spent so long protecting herself from disappointment and heartbreak that she'd forgotten what it felt like to hope, to trust, to love. They were married in the small church in town on a perfect May morning, with wildflowers from their garden decorating the altar. Emma wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, and Jacob wore his best suit with a wildflower boutonniere that made him smile every time he looked down at it. The townspeople who attended were surprised by the transformation in both of them. Jacob stood straighter, smiled more freely, and seemed to have found peace with his scars. Emma glowed with a happiness that made her beautiful beyond measure. As they stood at the altar exchanging vows, Emma thought about the journey that had brought them together. She'd left town that snowy night expecting to trade her labor for basic survival, but she'd found something infinitely more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and love. "You may kiss the bride," the minister said, and Jacob did, tenderly and with a joy that made Emma's heart soar. Years later, as Emma watched their children play in the garden she and Jacob had built together, she would often think about that desperate night when she'd knocked on his door. The townspeople had called it a marriage of convenience, a practical arrangement that benefited them both. But Emma knew better. It hadn't been convenience that had made Jacob open his door to a desperate stranger. It hadn't been practicality that had made him offer her dignity along with shelter. And it certainly hadn't been necessity that had grown into the deep, abiding love they shared. It had been kindness, the simple, transformative power of human compassion. Jacob had seen her not as a burden or a charity case, but as a person worthy of care and respect. And in doing so, he'd not only saved her life, he'd given her a reason to live it fully. Their ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where travelers could find a warm meal and a safe place to rest. Emma and Jacob never turned anyone away, understanding better than most how quickly circumstances could change, how thin the line was between security and desperation. "Everyone deserves a chance to start over," Jacob would say, echoing the words he'd spoken to Emma on that first night. And Emma would nod, remembering how those words had felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch was peaceful, Emma and Jacob would sit on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Emma would lean against Jacob's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the strength of his arms around her. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked one such evening. Knocking on a stranger's door that night, Emma smiled, turning to look at the man who had become her anchor, her partner, her greatest blessing. "Never," she said firmly. "That night I thought I was trading myself for shelter. But what I really did was trade my old life for a new one, a better one than I ever could have imagined." Jacob kissed the top of her head, his voice warm with contentment. "Sometimes the best things come from the most desperate moments." Emma nodded, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. She thought about all the people who might be out there right now, facing their own desperate moments, wondering if tomorrow would bring hope or heartbreak. She hoped they would find their own Jacob Turner, someone willing to see past circumstances to the person beneath, someone who understood that kindness, like love, multiplies when it's shared freely. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of the roses Emma had planted near the porch. She closed her eyes and listened for a moment to the sounds of home. The lowing of cattle in the distance, the soft rustle of leaves, the steady beating of Jacob's heart beneath her cheek. This was what happiness felt like, she realized, not the desperate, grasping kind that depended on circumstances, but the deep, quiet contentment that came from being exactly where you belonged, with exactly the right person, building exactly the life you were meant to live. She'd traded herself for shelter that snowy night, but Jacob had given her so much more. He'd given her a home, a future, and most importantly, the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, kindness could still light the way forward. And that, Emma thought as she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, was the most precious gift of all.